Just to say, I want to really thank everyone for coming to these meetings, because I think the meetings have been very good. We've covered a lot of really interesting ground through the course of this academic year, which has been extremely helpful to us in terms of organizing our treatments, our patient care, and also our research endeavor through these meetings. And I'm excited that we can develop these for next year. What I wanted to talk about today is something that we haven't touched on, which is actually what initially got me interested in the whole field of cardiac arrest. So the topic of the talk today is conscious awareness, mental and cognitive experiences during cardiac arrest. I think before we actually go into the meat of it, I just want to tell you, what initiated me and my interest, which were two things. One was that, and I'm sure everyone's experienced this, when I was a medical student, I noticed that a lot of patients who are having cardiac arrest were getting different treatment. And unfortunately, as you can imagine, that becomes a life and death issue if you don't get the best treatment, or if there is subjectivity with respect to treatment that you should receive. The other thing that got me very interested in this was that I remember I was on elective from England in New York, actually, at Mount Sinai Hospital. And I admitted a patient to the emergency room who came in with hemoptysis. He was coughing up blood, but he looked very stable. And I loved this guy. We spoke for over an hour of time. I met his family. He was amazing. And I left him, and 30 minutes after I left him, there was a cardiac arrest call in the emergency room. So being a student, I was all excited. I ran down, pulled the curtains aside to where the action was, and I saw that there was essentially this sea of white coats with this, basically what looked like a dead body to me. It took a few minutes to realize this was the same person that I'd been talking to half an hour earlier. And he was already flatlined. He was having a massive hemoptysis. They were trying to get a bronchoscope to try, and obviously that never works, and he was not able to be saved. But they tried for, I want to say, at least 45 minutes to an hour. And I remember at one point standing in the corner and just looking at this whole process and looking at this, essentially what was a dead body who had flatlined, and thinking to myself, well, what happened to this sweet human being who I was talking to 30 minutes ago? What happened to his mind, his consciousness? Is he able to see us? Is he able to hear us? He's clearly dead, but they're trying to save him. When did he really die? And I'd heard at that time that people who have cardiac arrest, there were anecdotes of people who have the ability to sort of recall seeing things. They describe watching doctors and nurses resuscitating them, and then having these very profound transformative experiences. So being young and naive, I was in my early 20s. I decided I'm going to go back to England, and I'm going to study this during my residency. And a year and a half later, I'll have all the answers, and we'll be done. And of course, that event shaped my entire future, because I became more and more engrossed in the brain during cardiac arrest, trying to understand what happens to this person. And then through my own training and specialization, we are where we are today, which is that I'm essentially studying everything to do with cardiac arrest and still focusing on the brain. But I did want to talk about the question of the mind and consciousness in this context, because the area has evolved enormously from 20 years ago when I first got involved with this. And I think it's particularly pertinent with some of the latest discoveries that are coming out. So just to start, and for the sake of everyone, be on the same page, that essentially no matter why people die, whether it's a heart attack, a stroke, a car accident, whatever you can think of, you're hemorrhaging, you're poisoned, the final step that causes a person to die is that you don't get enough oxygen being delivered to your heart, and as a consequence, the heart muscles cannot beat. When the heart stops beating, a person becomes lifeless, motionless. They meet the three criteria for death, which is that they have no heartbeat, no respiration, and they have fixed dilated pupils, indicating that the brainstem doesn't work. And life used to be very easy until about 50, 60 years ago, because essentially when that moment happened, that's why we have a concept of a moment of death. We still require, giving a time of death, which really equates to when the heart stops. And until the discovery of CPR, things were very easy, because when your heart stopped, that was an irreversible moment, and there was nothing you could do about it. Then with the discovery of CPR in the early 1960s, people realized there's a bit of a blurring of this boundary between life and death, because you could potentially bring people back who would have otherwise been dead for up to, say, 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But what's really remarkable is that what we're seeing now more and more, and many of you would have seen the paper that got published 2 weeks ago in Nature, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, is that it's only after a person has died that the cells inside the body start to undergo their own process of death. And that, contrary to what physicians have been taught for years, that you only have 5 or 10 minutes before you get permanent brain damage, that is absolutely incorrect, that the cells take many hours, if not days of time, before they become permanently damaged, including in the brain itself. And so it opens up a whole avenue of research for us to try to be able to study what happens to the molecular processes that are occurring in the brain and the rest of the body. And if they have a potentially reversible condition, try to go back, fix the underlying problem, and bring back a whole person. Clearly, there is a point which none of us knows, when cells in the body have become irreversibly and irretrievably damaged, but it's clearly not 5 to 10 minutes or a short time. And that's also important because it affects a lot of what we do. You know, many of us will stop resuscitating patients because we think there's this 5 to 10 minute rule before they get permanent brain damage. And what we're understanding is that actually your downtime is less important than we thought. It's all the secondary injury and the processes that are occurring after you've restarted the heart that cause damage. But of course, another area that becomes very interesting is, well, what happens to these people who've essentially gone beyond this threshold of death, because there's biologically no difference between cardiac arrest and death by cardiopulmonary criteria. So what happens to the human mind and consciousness in people who've gone beyond that threshold of death, which is also a fascinating topic and of interest. I also want to just slightly demystify death a bit more, because again, most people have this sort of philosophical notion about death, and even in medicine we often sort of, you know, subconsciously I think, or perhaps even consciously, still think of it that way, which is that there's this moment where you just can't be brought back again. But the reality is, if you think about from the perspective of the brain, when a person has died, essentially they go into a coma. That is no different to any other medical process that we have. In other words, we usually have the sleep-wake cycle, and we have different neurotransmitters that modulate our sense of consciousness, of being awake and alert. And when different disease states affect these neurotransmitters, we go from being conscious to the outside world to being unconscious, which is essentially what our coma patients are. Think about death. All that happens is the lack of oxygen getting into the brain causes a person to switch into a state of being externally unconscious. But it doesn't tell us what happens to that entity, the thing that makes us who we are when we've gone through the first phase of death. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these aspects as we go along. And one of the things that I found remarkable is that I feel like the media picked up on the notion that death is actually reversible earlier than we have picked up as physicians, as clinicians, as nurses, as whoever who works in hospitals. This was a front cover of Newsweek in 2007, and it says clearly, this man was dead, he isn't anymore. I think most people thought they're just playing with words, and it isn't true. People who have a cardiac arrest have really died. They've gone beyond the threshold of death. He received hypothermia treatment, he had an early cardiac catheterization, and he's a young man who went back to his family, back to work. And now, if we fast forward from, this was 2007 now, to 2019, as I mentioned, this remarkable paper that was published just 2 weeks ago in Nature by a group out of Yale, where they demonstrated that you can actually take a pig brain that has been dead for more than 4 hours, or 4 hours I should say, and actually by infusing a particular solution that mimics blood, slightly different but same concept, they were able to restore partial brain activity, partial brain function I should say. And in particular, they were able to get, for example, the microcirculation in the brain to work. And I'm sure we're going to have a whole discussion about this paper in the coming sessions, because it isn't something that I'm going to do justice to if I try to cover it in this session. But I just want to illustrate the fact that even though people have died and a person has gone beyond the threshold of death, it takes many hours of time before the brain becomes irreversibly damaged. And the concept we have of 5 or 10 minutes of anoxia is not correct, which is what this shows to us. We kind of were getting the gist of this, that this was happening. And this is one of the things that I found remarkable. On the one hand, you would do an ACLS course and they would tell you have 5 minutes before permanent brain damage. But then you'd hear of all these people who were saved like hours of time after they had died, except that they happened to have been cold. But then people become cold after they've died. It's not like they were like freezing and then they died. I mean, there was something process going on. And so there was a lot of question in my mind that this doesn't seem to be correct. Just to go through it though, this lady here that you see is, she's a practicing radiologist in Sweden. She was a medical student. She fell into a lake, died, and wasn't found, from what I understand, for 7 or 8 hours afterwards. This gentleman we see here, I'm sure Jim knows, this is Joe Tirolosi, who was a patient who came to Cornell about 10 years ago when we were fellows over there. He was resuscitated. It was just when FDNY had mandated hypothermia treatment for the city of New York. He was cooled. He went to the cath lab early. He had almost an hour of resuscitation. And remarkably, he came back. And what's really, I think, truly remarkable about some of these things is that the arbitrariness, like in other words, he got coded for an hour, But somebody could have stopped resuscitating them at 45 minutes or at 40 minutes, and then he would have been declared dead. Whereas somebody else decided to prolong the course. So that was some of the things that I think are interesting. And then again, if this person had been found in the United States, it's probable the lady in Sweden, she would have been declared dead by the ambulances because it was so many hours after she had died. There are many other cases that have been shown and published. There was one a year ago in France of somebody who was found 18 hours post-mortem. He was in his 50s, a 53-year-old man who was resuscitated. He was put on ECMO, warmed up progressively, and went home without brain damage. But again, I'm sure that person in the United States would have been declared dead. So the fact is that what we're seeing is that death is not as clear-cut as we thought it is, and it's not as simple as we thought it is, and there's a lot of reversibility to death itself after it's happened. Of course, what are the things that we're now doing above and beyond CPR? We have machines that can deliver more effective chest compressions. You can put them on somebody for hours of time, which humans cannot deliver. We've understood the power of cooling people down and how that can preserve the brain, and as well as other systems like extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, in which we can put a catheter into somebody's body, take blood out, and actually have a membrane oxygenate it and then push it back and essentially go back and fix the underlying problem, which I think is probably much more effective than our manual CPR that we do. And in my opinion, that should be the future of resuscitation for everybody who's at least got a salvageable condition. But of course, we've talked about a lot of this throughout our meetings. What I want to emphasize here is one thing that we're all afraid of, which is to get somebody, particularly a young person, let's say, like this young lady here, who has a cardiac arrest. We do all this stuff, we bring them back, but essentially we bring back a husk of who they were, a body that is essentially soulless, right? A person who's got a vegetative state, whose consciousness is no longer present, at least as far as we can tell, and who then lives for years later in this state, but really, what state have we brought them back to? And so I think what's very important, which is part of the reason why we have incorporated the study of the human mind and consciousness into cardiac arrest, is that in order to understand and understand how to avoid disorders of consciousness, you have to integrate the study of consciousness into cardiac arrest. You can't just think of it as something separate. It has to be part of what we do. Probably should be part of all of ICU care, frankly, and I don't think we do enough of it. But at least I'm proud to say that we've integrated that. And of course, the outcomes that people have after cardiac arrest are variable. As I mentioned earlier, because of the lack of oxygen, they all go into a coma initially. But hopefully, if they recover, they'll develop normal consciousness. If that disorder continues, they can end up with brain death. But then you can end up potentially with these disorders of consciousness, like a minimally conscious state or a persistent vegetative state that take place. But what is clearly important is that we have to understand the mechanism to try to avoid those outcomes, rather than just sort of watching and waiting to see what eventually happens. And that is a part of our work that we will be getting into. But what I want to do is just sort of flip the coin a little bit around and just say that it's like looking at two parts of the coin. You know, in order for us to be able to save the brain and avoid these conditions, we have to study what happens to the brain after the person has gone beyond the threshold of death. And what that's doing is, inadvertently, we're studying essentially what happens to people beyond the threshold of death, which includes what happens to your human mind and consciousness that used to be conceived as being or perceived as being a very much philosophical question. And I think of it a lot like, you know, if you had a father and a son looking 150 years ago, looking at the sky, and the son was saying, look, do you think we'll ever be able to overcome gravity and go to the moon? The father would say that's completely ludicrous. That's just, you know, science fiction, or it's just, you know, it's some, you know, beliefs that people might have. And what you see is that through years of endeavor and mostly failure in the 19th century, eventually some people came out with a contraption that could fly for 27 seconds, you know, just a couple of meters above the ground. But what that started was it demonstrated the ability to overcome gravity. And within 60 years, because of our endeavor, we were able to go to the moon and come back. And so where we are with the study of human mind and consciousness is that it shouldn't be considered really as philosophical anymore, in my opinion. We deal with life and death all the time in the hospital, in the ICU, and we're able to show that we can study it through scientific means. We are very much in the early stage, but the fact is that we've taken off the ground and we've shown that it falls within the remit of science. There are many millions of people who have survived cardiac arrest and come back now. One day I should do a calculation, but we estimate there are about 1 million cardiac arrests in the United States alone every year between in and out of hospital cardiac arrests. If you assume a 10% survival, you're looking at about 100,000 people a year who come back. Multiply that by 40 years, you'll see how many people you've had just in the US who've survived cardiac arrest, and that's not even just global. And what we see is that among these many millions of people, persistently, people have started reporting having these very interesting, unusual experiences from the time when they were essentially beyond that threshold of death in their cardiac arrest. Some of them are famous people, Hollywood actresses, and some of them are just regular people like us. Some of them are small children, some of them are adults, it just depends. But what's interesting is that they've all described a persistent theme, which is that when they were in that state, they had essentially a transformative experience. They were able to feel peaceful, they didn't have pain. They often describe seeing a bright, warm light that almost draws the person towards it like a magnet. They describe often encountering, or the perception of encountering, their deceased relatives, usually parents. They've often described going to a place that they describe as being very beautiful. And what I find fascinating are the two particular elements that I'm going to focus on today, which is the process by which they actually describe reviewing themselves, but reviewing their humanity, who they were as human beings. And what they've described is that they go through everything that they've done, all their actions throughout their entire life, goes through and they re-experience it. And oftentimes they say they not only experience all those actions themselves and judge themselves based upon their humanity, but they actually re-experience it from the perception of the other people that they've been in touch with. So clearly, when I die, what's going to happen is I'm going to review my entire life. I'm going to remember this moment. And all of you who might be in pain and distress of having to listen to me, I'm going to re-experience all of your pain and distress. And be like, oh my God, they were so polite. I sat there and listened to all of this. But you know, it's amazing to think about, but these are what people have said. And if you multiply it, there are millions of people who've said it. And what's also fascinating is that there are people who say that during their cardiac arrest, they were able to watch, they describe very accurately events that were going on during their resuscitation, except that from our perspective, they were essentially dead. I remember years ago when I first started doing this, this was in the 90s, one of our cardiologists saw me in the corridor, this was in England, and he pulled me aside and said, like, I want to tell you something. I'm not going to repeat this ever again. I don't want to ever talk about it again. I don't want you to ask me ever again. I'm just going to tell you this once. So I said, well, what is it? His name was Richard. He said, oh, I was a cardiac arrest team leader. He was working in Leeds at the time in England. And he said, this was a big university hospital. He said, we had a 32-year-old man who had a cardiac arrest. We got called to the arrest, we resuscitated. He was in asystole. But because he was young, we tried. We tried really hard. We tried for 45 minutes, and we couldn't get him back. And then at some point, we decided as a team that we should stop. So he said, I checked the gain, I checked the leads, I made sure that this was true asystole, even though he was definitely blue and he was definitely dead. He had no pulse for all this time. And there was nothing there. So we declared him dead, called the family, and I went in the other room and I was writing my notes to describe the cardiac arrest event. And I realized, 10, 15 minutes later that I couldn't remember exactly how much adrenaline we'd given this guy. So I went back in the room to check with the head nurse, and as I was talking to her, I just glanced at this guy, and I suddenly noticed he's not as pink, he's not as blue, I'm sorry, as when we left him. So he's like, that's very bizarre, what do I do? So I looked again, and he told the nurse, and he's like, yeah, he definitely doesn't look as blue as when we left him. So he said, I checked his pulse in his groin, and he had a pulse. So we're like, what the hell do we do now? So they called the cardiac arrest team again, they put the pager out, everyone came, they resuscitated him, and they sent him to the ICU. And he said, we thought he's definitely going to have brain damage. There's no doubt about this, of course. So a week later, or sometime later, he said, I was on the ward seeing another patient, and I saw this man just waving at me. So I went up to him, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. And he said, oh, you don't remember me? I was the patient who you were resuscitating. And then he went on to describe all the details of the conversations and all the events that were going on at that time, the way he looked at everything that had happened to him, which of course freaked him out, right? Which is why he said, I've never talked about this to anyone. I don't want to ever talk about it again. I'm just telling you this is what happened to me, and I don't want to discuss it anymore. If you happen to be in the field like I am, and you talk about this enough, then you see there are enough clinicians and nurses who've been around who will tell you of patients. I've had many clinicians tell me these. I have a friend and a colleague who told me about a child that she resuscitated in the back of an ambulance who was 9 years old, who they were coding while she was being transferred from one hospital to the other, who essentially then came back and remembered her, remembered she was talking to her, and all the other events that were going on. So the point is, much like death itself, that we're now beginning to understand is such a remarkable process, what happens to your mind and consciousness is also a remarkable process that we're beginning to just shed some light on. People have referred to these in my opinion, incorrectly, and I'm not going to use this term again, but just because you may have heard about it, by the so-called near-death experience. The problem with this phrase is that it's very inaccurate because we don't have anything that we describe as a so-called near-death event. I mean, you either have a biological process where you're at the point of death or you're not. And because this term is so ambiguous and it's improperly defined, it's led to a lot of debate and controversy. So I'm going to put that away, but just to tell you that there have been reports of people who've had these kinds of transformative experiences for many years, although they were first described by a physician in 1975. We've had anecdotes going back before. This is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, where he seems to be showing people going towards a light through a tunnel. And what's of course interesting is that that's not the general description that I would imagine would have been prevalent in the 15th or 16th century about what happens when you die. You know, I think most people thought of like a man who's going to judge you. But anyway, so we don't know whether Bosch had a near-death event. Somebody told them. We don't really know, but nonetheless it's been shown. The point though is that these experiences have now been described from all over the world, all different cultures, and all different age groups. In particular in small children. I remember when I first started this, people sent me their experiences, and I interviewed a small child who'd had a cardiac arrest when he hadn't even been 3 years old. And he had then reported through the course of play to his parents and grandparents that, you know, when you die you see a bright lamp. And he described what was going on in the ambulance. Apparently the buckle had come undone, and which the ambulance crews had confirmed. And they wrote to me, and what they noticed was that he kept on drawing this same theme. So obviously he wasn't drawing this when he was 3, but as he was getting older, he kept on drawing the same theme, which is this sort of person with this attachment. And eventually when they asked him what this was, he said, oh, when you die, you see a bright lamp. So this was supposed to be the lamp. And that you have, again, in child's words, you have a sort of a cord that you're attached to, which I've heard from many adults who say the same thing. I eventually interviewed him when he was 6, and he drew this picture of himself watching himself in the ambulance when he was being resuscitated for me. I don't know why, but the son isn't looking very happy. But nonetheless, that was whatever that meant. I don't know. And this is him. His name also was Sam. He was very cute. And I went to his home. That's his grandmother who wrote to me about the experience. And I interviewed him, and we talked about what he'd experienced. And there are many others that I interviewed. In fact, at the time, I collected around 500 cases of people who'd had these incredible experiences. And that really taught me a lot about what it is from their perspective. Most of them are afraid to talk about it because they're afraid of ridicule. But nonetheless, if they think they can trust you, they'll tell you about their experiences. I'm just focusing on 2 of the themes that they talk about. This is the perception that they have of watching things from above. So this was one patient who wrote to me who said, I was high on the ceiling of the ward, looking down upon the bed, which seemed to be a long way down, and saw the doctors and nurses around the bed working on the person lying there. She then realized that was her, and they were working on her. And then this is what I mentioned to you about the review process. This is highly, highly condensed. It was much more detailed what this person said and was fascinating. But he says here, I found there was a being beside me. It was a comforting presence, a reassuring presence, but was also a presence of magnitude and power. Then I began a review of my life, of the key moments of my life. But at the same time, I was re-experiencing it from other people's points of view. And that was a stunner, because you feel their pain, you feel the sting, you feel the hurt. And this is a recurrent theme that I've seen when we study these people. They say this over and over again. And it's very, very interesting because it's almost like the person is judging themselves, or you end up judging yourself, but based upon your humanity. So when I started this, again, more than 20 years ago, there was some literature, people had started thinking about why these experiences occurred. And if you wanted to sort of narrow them down into 3 broad categories, this is what they were. So one hypothesis was that these are just some sort of erratic brain activity as a consequence of some physiological trigger, typically a lack of oxygen. Lack of oxygen causes people to have these hallucinations. They're not real, and they're even like psychedelic drug-induced states that you might get in other situations. The problem with that was that it was just purely theoretical. There were no studies to ever support that at all. And in particular, this oxygen theory was completely made no sense. We deal with patients who have different levels of oxygen throughout the ICU, from 0 to near normal to in the middle. And people don't start telling you, oh, I'm seeing a tunnel as my oxygen goes down. But this is what was proposed, is that your oxygen goes down and you start to imagine seeing a tunnel because of your gradual sort of shutting down of your occipital cortex, which again, it's very good theory, but no evidence to support it. The other theory that was put forward was that it must be some sort of psychological process. So people who think they're about to die are going to comfort themselves by imagining something very nice for themselves in that time. The problem is when you're having a cardiac arrest, you don't usually predict it beforehand. It's a very sudden event. And the third was that it must be some sort of, maybe what they're saying is true, maybe that their consciousness is somehow separate and they're able to gain information from when they were in a cardiac arrest. The other theory that I found, which I'm just going to show you, which of course is not true, is that maybe when you get very sick, you go to the hospital, a bunch of evil-looking surgeons will come and shine a bright light in your eyes, and then 6 months later they find you on Oprah talking about this amazing experience that you had when you suddenly saw a light. Okay. The point here was that none of these had been shown. These were just things that were, except for the fourth one, that had been postulated. Since then, there have been discussions about this whole perception of being separate from your body, the so-called out-of-body experience. There are some papers that have been published that have tried to explain this away, but they have very significant limitations, and I'm just going to touch on these very quickly. Most of it is related to the fact that we're often not talking about the same thing. In other words, there isn't a proper definition, so people are using these terms incorrectly to describe other phenomena. So one experiment, for example, was where they took people, and these were published like in major journals, and it surprises me, but that's what it is. They took people in a lab, and in fact we have a camera here. They would put a camera behind you, okay, and put goggles on your eyes so that all you could see through your goggles are what the camera is showing you, which is basically your own back, okay? And you sit there for a couple of hours, you'll start to forget your own perception of how things should be, and you'll start to see your own back through the goggles, and that's what you see, of course, as being your entire field of perception, right, your vision. And then what they did, they took a hammer, as you can see there, or an object, and attacked the camera, right, that's behind you, and they saw that people startled, right, because they thought that the hammer is hitting them. And then they concluded, oh look, we've reproduced an out-of-body experience in the lab because you had a perception of seeing yourself where you weren't really yourself. Do you see what I mean? It's exactly, I see your face. It's a very bizarre conclusion. And the point I'm saying is that some of these experiments are really disingenuous. Like that's not what these people are describing. They're describing real events from the corner of the room that are verified by physicians and nurses. The other was that in one case, and this, I don't know if it's been reproduced, but in one case they stimulated the right angular gyrus in a particular patient when they were having epilepsy treatment. And they found that this person was having this illusion, you can imagine that your body's coming, like elongating out and coming back and forth as they were stimulated. But it's not the same as what people are describing to us. You having an elongation of your body is very different to what these people have said. And the third category, which again you'll see is in the news not that long ago, is that if you take psychedelic drugs, you have features of what sounds like a near-death experience. If you examine these experiences, they're entirely different. They are not the same thing at all. But unfortunately, because our definitions and classifications are not correct, people can make these kinds of conclusions. But one thing that does definitely happen to people after they've had a cardiac arrest and had one of these experiences is that they become very positively transformed. And that's one of the things we're really interested in. They're less afraid of death. They have a different mindset about life. They develop greater altruism. They have essentially a change in their core values. They're engaged more with family. They're more engaged with helping other people. And they see life very differently. What I've said is they have a more balanced view of materiality. They're still active. They still work hard. But they don't see that as being the be-all and end-all. They find greater importance in their humanity. You can imagine because of what they've experienced at the time. And this has often been picked up in the media. This was when I was in England. This was a cartoon from the Daily Mail, which is one of our newspapers over there. This is Norman. This is a typical English pub in the north of England. People having a pint of Guinness, as you can see. Clearly, he's had a so-called near-death experience and had one of these transformative events. And his friends, who are a bunch of miners, are telling him, here, Norm, you had one of them near-death experiences, didn't you? And it's just showing you this sort of concept that they become transformed. I don't know if he actually grew wings and a halo, but nonetheless, that's what it is. But one of the big questions that has come up through the years, of course, is, and you may appreciate this a bit more, is how can these people having full consciousness, how can they have full memory formation, well-structured thought processes, from a time when they're in a cardiac arrest, where essentially, at best, you may have minimal blood flow that's not sufficient to generate metabolic activity in the brain, and at worst, you have no blood flow into the brain. So if you look at the theories that have been proposed, one is that, well, maybe what's happening is that you're having these experiences just before your brain is flatlined, right, just before your brain is shut down, but you later think that you had it during your cardiac arrest, or maybe the experience was occurring after your brain came back online, but not during the period when you're in a true cardiac arrest, because that should not be happening. It should also be noted that in a cardiac arrest or any brain insult, you would expect significant memory loss, which reflects the severity of the insult itself. And what's remarkable is that these people do have memory loss, but they don't seem to forget that one experience. So they might forget events that were going on that led them to go to the hospital and events after they recovered, but they seem to remember these experiences very, very vividly. So I got involved in this, and this was one of the things that we started to test. And again, this is not just another cartoon to show you. This was me 20 years ago, supposedly. They were predicting what I look like today. Hopefully I don't look quite like that, maybe. And this is me saying, no, I don't want to come in. I'm just researching out-of-body experiences for Southampton General Hospital, which is where I used to work, standing at the pearly gates of heaven. So we recognize that it's important to study consciousness in people who have a cardiac arrest. And that was when I first started doing this, and it picked up some traction. But the key thing we tried to do, we did a bunch of smaller studies where we looked at cardiac arrest patients. The first one was published in 2001, and we showed that people do have these kinds of mental experiences. And then it culminated into the AWARE study. It took me many years to get funding and set up the infrastructure, but we did a large multi-center study across 15 hospitals with 33 investigators in the United States, in Austria, and in England. And we looked at 2,060 cardiac arrest patients. And we looked at their memories, and we tried to conduct interviews. And this is the flowchart from that study, which is a little bit more complicated to go through. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to summarize it for you in the next slide, which is that what we found was that unfortunately, to this day, which is the other area that we work on, is that the majority of people who have cardiac arrest do not survive. So 84% of them died, either from not having the heart restarted or subsequently in the ICU. We had roughly 330 survivors, of whom many were not able to give interviews. They weren't well enough. So 101 people actually gave us full interviews. And what we found, which was really interesting, was that there seemed to be a sort of a breadth of conscious recollections going on. There were some people who had actually no sense of awareness when you interviewed them about their events. But what was really strange, and I cannot explain it to this day, is that almost 40% of people had a perception of having had some level of awareness from their cardiac arrest, but they had no explicit recall. They couldn't tell us details, but they just thought they had been aware. And of course, as you know, explicit recall or lack of explicit recall doesn't mean that you didn't have an experience. Then there were about 10% who had these similar experiences, these transformative experiences. And about 2.5%, or in fact 2 people, had descriptions of full visual and auditory awareness from the time of their cardiac arrest. One of them was too ill to give us a subsequent follow-up interview to check the validity of what she said. But one of them had a full interview with me, and he described specific events that were going on between 3 to 5 minutes into his cardiac arrest that were validated by the charts and the clinicians and nurses who were in the room. So this became really significant because it was the first time ever, and although it was only one case, and I appreciate it, it wasn't as many as people would love, but the reality is it was the first time we were able to validate and show the timing of when the experience was occurring. That the experience was occurring actually during the period of cardiac arrest where we would have expected brain function to have ceased during that time. The other point that it raised is that could there be a spectrum? Could there be like an iceberg effect, a spectrum of consciousness, where essentially there are more people who are conscious but they lose their memories, and then progressively you have more smaller proportion who have full awareness of what's going on. And why that occurs, we don't know. Is it something to do with their brain resuscitation? Is it something that we're doing differently to them? We simply don't know. But this was the first study that demonstrated this. And I'm pleased to say it's now led to different research by different other people. I've seen papers being published around it. But this was, again, the point I just wanted to make for people, because they often ask me, they say, well, it was just, is this a case report? I'm like, no, this is not a case report. You have to consider the fact that there are millions of people who've reported these events. We didn't have the scientific way of trying to show it, and this was the first study to try to verify it. In the same way that it's like saying, was the Wright brothers plane going up for 27 seconds, it was just a one-off event? Well, it was actually showing that it's possible to have consciousness. So that's led to our subsequent studies in this area. The AWARE-2 project, which we've now set up, it's a multi-center study across up to 25 major hospitals in Europe and the United States. We've integrated brain monitoring into this, oxygen monitoring, brain function monitoring, to see what's happening in the brain. and we install a tablet, like an iPad in the room, that gives audio-visual stimuli, as many of you might see, and we can then go back and track whether people had recollections of what was happening, the exact time of it, but also we're trying to look at implicit learning in these people to see if there was actually a greater depth of consciousness going on that we would not have known about. The other thing I just want to point out is that I'm very pleased to say that this work has culminated in many other areas of neuromonitoring, which we are probably the world leaders on in terms of how to monitor what's happening in the brain in real time during cardiac arrest. And many publications have come out from this work that started. But this is just to show you, this is our actually our data from a year ago. The date there is not entirely correct, but just to show you what really happens is that still most people who have cardiac arrest are not surviving. If you look currently, we've had more than 4,000 cardiac arrest events at our hospitals that are participating with us, but still, even take the proportion of people who are during working hours, i.e. 9 to 5 roughly, of almost 2,000 people, the vast majority of them do not survive. And here you see that the number of people who are recruited are 465, but again, the majority of these people don't survive. And in fact, the survival rate here among those who are recruited is around 10%, which is really very, very poor. You have to remember, these are people who've had at least 5 minutes of cardiac arrest, so it's not the people who had a quick shock who came back. And what I've learned from doing this research is that the data that's presented about survival from in-hospital cardiac arrest is overestimated. Like people say we have 25% survival, 30% survival, because that includes a lot of people who didn't have a true cardiac arrest. You know, they had, like, I didn't feel a pulse, so I did CPR, and then they came back. Mucus plugging. When you take a true cardiac arrest, in other words, they had no pulse for 5 minutes, you see that our survival outcomes are so poor, and they haven't changed for more than 50 years, and why we're trying to work so hard to save all of that. But what it also raises for me, which I want to talk a little bit about towards the end of this now, is, you know, what do we know about consciousness? You know, what is it? How does it work? And how can these people have consciousness present when they're in cardiac arrest? Of course, I'm sure we all realize that consciousness is probably the biggest scientific problem. It's the most important scientific problem, and we have no idea how it comes to be. In other words, we all know that we're conscious thinking beings, but we have no idea how our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions arise from the brain. Right? And a lot of people have proposed that somehow, even though if you look at a gross brain and you slice it up and you look at the different tracts and the different pathways, and you break it down even into single brain cells itself, right? You can't show how thought arises. And if I were to then say to you, looking down a microscope, well, look, this is a brain cell. It's thinking, I feel hungry, or I'm tired, or I feel guilty. You'd say, well, this is crazy. You know, brain cell produces protein. It doesn't have thought. Somehow, if we put together 5 or 10 or 100 or 1,000 or a million of these cells, somehow we think that consciousness sort of just appears out of this. And that's what I call like the down-up phenomena. You know, that somehow as an epiphenomena, through complex activity of brain cells, your thoughts, your consciousness arise out of this. And that's been something that's been proposed for a number of years. But the problem with that is it doesn't account for what we see in the real world. In other words, if that was the case, first of all, we have no mechanism. There is no biological mechanism that's plausible that could account for how thoughts could arise. But we're all thinking conscious beings. The other problem with it is, of course, you have a singular entity. You know, you have billions of brain cells, right? But then there is a single me, a single Sam. How could that possibly come about? You also have, you know, and these are not mine, these are what's put in the literature. How do you account for this when you have organisms that don't have neurons, like simple organisms? Are we to say that they don't have consciousness at all, just because they don't have brain cells? And I think most of all, what we do know is that the evidence we have, where we see sort of an association between activity of different parts of the brain, say on an MRI scan, and conscious thoughts and feelings, is just simply an association. It's a correlation. There's no causation here. We have no way to account for it. And so that's led some people to question this thought. And there are others who propose that, well, maybe then consciousness, the thing that makes us who we are, doesn't arise necessarily from, doesn't have to arise from neurons as such, but it arises from microtubular structures. There's sort of the scaffolding that holds cells together, and that maybe obviously exists in other cells as well. And that's put forward by Stuart Hameroff, who's an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, and Roger Penrose, a mathematician from University of Cambridge. Again, people found it interesting, but it doesn't explain how consciousness comes to be. Others have proposed, David Chalmers is a philosopher, an Australian philosopher who's actually now at NYU, has proposed that maybe we have to think of consciousness as essentially being an entity in its own right. For example, you don't take mass or gravity and try to reduce it down to something else. You just accept it as a fact in its own right. And building on that is this concept that, well, maybe there's a top-down phenomena. In other words, maybe it's really your mind or consciousness that's actually activating your brain. So rather than the brain leading to it, maybe it's the consciousness that's activating the brain when you have a thought. And that's what we're seeing on your MRI scan. And that it's essentially undiscovered. So we haven't discovered the entity that is human mind, but it exists, it has its own reality, and it is modulating what we're seeing in the MRI scan that we've talked about. And if you look in the literature, essentially there are two different camps of people. There's a Nobel Prize winner, Crick, who was a co-discoverer of DNA, who believes that consciousness just comes up as an epiphenomenon from the brain. And then Sir John Eccles was a neuroscientist who was a Nobel Prize winner in the 1960s for his work on synaptic transmission. And he published extensively that mind and consciousness are separate from the brain. You cannot reduce it down to the brain. You have to think of it as being separate. There's a neuroscientist that I discovered right now who's working in California, in San Diego, UCSD, who's also proposed that consciousness is a separate entity from the brain. And what I like the most is this concept by Professor Lahi that you might think of consciousness like electromagnetic phenomena. And that's important because, think about it, electromagnetic waves can carry sound and picture, right? But they're not necessarily produced from a TV set or a radio set. You use it all the time. It has the same properties that human consciousness have. And it might be that that's what we're dealing with, and we haven't yet had the tools to measure it. So while we know, of course, the brain is completely modulating consciousness, the big question is the brain your hard drive, right, where everything is coming from that? Or is it acting more like the RAM? You need to have it to be able to get your computer to work, to be able to get your memories from your different files and things to function, but it isn't the originator of consciousness, and we simply don't have an answer. But the thing I do want to point out, and I often talk about this with people who are in the lab, is that what we do know is that reality has different layers to it. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, our ability to perceive reality is very limited when we focus solely on our five senses. Animals can perceive a lot more than we can do, and that's been shown. And we've, to some extent, overcome that by devising tools, microscope, MRI scans that can take us to different layers of reality. But it's like an onion with different layers. And what I find interesting is that when we've made discoveries within one particular layer, we're often, and I think this is just some sort of mental bias that we have, we become very fixated in that one particular framework. And we recognize there must be different layers of reality behind that we can't access, but we sort of push it away. And I think with consciousness, that's what we're dealing with, is that there might be a different layer of reality that we haven't yet discovered that might be like electromagnetic phenomena. And it would account for a lot of what we do know. So I think sort of to come up towards the end of this talk, when you talk about what do we know about death, is that it is an enormous mystery. We're just making discoveries about it, and as well as how it has effects for our life itself. But what we do know is that I think when you do die, and if you see yourself looking at a sign, and you see you're suddenly this tall, and you see yourself on the operating table, then I think you might know that you're dead. This is a cartoon that came out. But aside from that, it really is an enormous mystery for all of us. And I often think about this, and we have a patient up in the ICU right now who's had a cardiac arrest. He's a young guy who came in. Some of you may know about the case. We deal with life and death all the time, not just cardiac arrest, but others. And what I've noticed is that we sort of forget about the fact that this is going to happen to us. Right? As clinicians, we deal with the biology. We move on to the next, not recognizing that one day I'm going to be the guy who's going to have a cardiac arrest. And so, of course, every single one of us is going to have a cardiac arrest. And that's what we are trying to study so we can help everyone. But while recognizing that we've sort of started to make these strides, we're starting to unravel what death is, what happens when we die, the big question is, how does that impact how we live our lives today? And this is something that I ask myself. So just to finish off on, is that, and I don't know if you agree with me, but often when we talk to families, patients themselves, when they come to the point when they realize they don't have long to live, suddenly meaning what life was all about, what we should have done, looking back, becomes very, very important. But somehow I think for most of us, until we get to that point, it's just something society in general just does not pay attention to. And I'm interested to see, and I've included this because I thought we'd integrate this, and I think it's important for palliative care and hospice care, is that the notion of spirituality has now become a part of end-of-life care. And I like this definition, which really revolves around the issue of meaning. That spirituality is a fundamental element of human experience. It encompasses the individual's search for meaning and purpose in life and the experience of the transcendent. And this is from a working group, a publication by a group of palliative care experts in 2009. And also, again, I've noticed that we've come into the boundary of dealing with like what is, what was been perceived as being religious maybe by some people, and I think that's what's caused a lot of bias. But the reality is when you survey physicians and doctors, they're not quite as extreme. There are a lot of people who have beliefs about these things that we should take into consideration. So when we look back, I think, at what people have told us who've survived cardiac arrest and come back, and in particular that review that they have of their lives, they come back, and that's why I think they change. They realize that life is meaningful, and it seems to be an educational process to try to develop and optimize their humanity. And what they all come back with is that our actions actually have meaning, and it is what we judge ourselves by towards the end of our lives. And it's not just what we say. So of course, this is something I'm not going to be able to get into. I neither have the expertise nor do we have the time today, but it raises a lot of interesting questions that sort of intersect between science, between what has been perceived as being philosophy or religion, about what is our purpose, what are we doing here, how are we supposed to conduct ourselves. Here's a picture of some of the greatest thinkers, Aristotle, Plato, and very many others, who've debated all these things. And what's really interesting is I think that now science, through its progress, is starting to look at all these things and be able to make further understanding that will help guide people. So where I'm trying to end this talk with is, while we do all these things about cardiac arrest and while we deal with the biology and all that, but we can't forget that there's a person there, and we can't perhaps ignore the lessons that are coming out from people who've survived and what they're telling us about how we should live our lives. So my very final slide here really is just, a lot of people ask me, so what are the other research studies that we're doing related to consciousness during cardiac arrest, the experience of cardiac arrest, and we have a whole series of studies that have been put together and developed. We're very grateful to a very large grant from the John Templeton Foundation to support a lot of these things. One of the areas that we're focusing on, which is in the orange box at the top, is we've realized that the descriptions that have been put forward about people's experiences so far are inaccurate. They're not sufficient. They don't cover what people really have said. The term near-death experience, as I said, is not a correct term. The people that we study have truly gone beyond the threshold of death, and so we call it an actual death experience. So one of our studies is we're trying to look at thousands of people who've survived and actually categorize the themes that they describe and how it transforms them and how it affects them. We also have recognized, unfortunately I put my hands up, that no matter how much we try, because there's so many issues that have to be overcome to save people with cardiac arrest, including institutional barriers, implementation barriers, that our survival rates are still terrible in cardiac arrest. And so what we're trying to do is study what happens to the human mind and consciousness in a subgroup of people who have deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. This is a condition where people are cooled down, essentially biologically taken to the point of death, cooled down to 18 degrees Celsius. Brain shuts down. They essentially stay in the state for 30, 45 minutes. And we're trying to replicate some of our studies in that group, while also looking at the long-term psychological transformative impact of the experience on people and trying to track the potential neuromodulators of that positive transformational change that people have. We're very interested in hearing about people's experiences, and we're going to be launching one of our studies through a website that we've developed, and the link for the website is here in one of our slides. Those who've had experiences and want to contact us are welcome to use this link to do that. And we saw that. And just to say, huge thanks to everybody who's worked with me. This was our team at Stony Brook who worked with me, a couple of my fellows, Lisa Reagan, who was a medical student, Caitlin O'Neill, a research coordinator who worked with me over there. And then we moved to NYU, and of course, some of the folks who are helping us here are sitting in this room. And some of them are not here, but huge gratitude to everyone, as well as our colleagues and investigators from other centers in the country, in the United States and elsewhere, who are participating in the AWARE-2 study and working with us on our whole platform of studies. So I think with that I'll end, and if you have any questions, we have a few minutes for that. Thank you very much. So this was obviously a very different take on the cardiac arrest. But I think it's just something that is not talked about often, but I think it's important to bear it in mind. I hope it helps you. You will see patients with this. It does happen. It's not that infrequent. And I think the whole discussion on consciousness is just taking a big step forward in this area.
Have you found any relationship between like end-tidal CO2 or brain oximetry levels during CPR and how often someone has this type of experience?
Yeah, one of the things we're trying to understand is, so one of the hypotheses is that maybe you're getting better brain resuscitation, or better resuscitation, which is I think what you're alluding to, and that's why you're able to have memories and consciousness formed. And that's really one of the main premises behind the AWARE-2 study. We don't have enough data right now for me to comment on, because as I said, a lot of people are unfortunately not surviving. But that would be what we'd be looking for. So end-tidal CO2 is a marker of the quality of the circulation, and brain oxygen is the quality of oxygen getting in the brain, and added to that being the EEG. So is there cortical activity going on? Is that why they're able to have memories? I don't know.
And the patients with PEA, some of whom will have pseudo-PEA, you can't feel the pulse, but they're perfusing.
Yes.
That also will complicate it if you include that group of patients.
Yeah, that's a very good point you brought. Actually, I was going to include it in this talk, but I didn't. But of course, I'll just to address that. There are some people who clearly have a pulse, but we think they're in a cardiac arrest. That's what you're referring to. And if that's the case, obviously, technically, they're not in a true cardiac arrest, but they're sort of mislabeled as a cardiac arrest because their heart hasn't stopped. It's just that they're weak, their pulse is too weak. When they get chest compressions, they can sometimes wake up. But that's a very different beast, because these people that we're talking about actually have no heartbeat. And in those people, if you look at all the studies, you only get about 15% to 20% of brain blood flow. And that's insufficient to get brain metabolism, which is why they have fixed dilated pupils. You can intubate them without sedation. They don't have a gag reflex. Their brain is not functioning in the middle of cardiac arrest, even with CPR. So in the first study, we didn't have any cases who were sort of waking up because they had an underlying heartbeat. But it is a subgroup that we have to be cognizant of, yes. That's very true. There are case reports that are published with people like that, but we haven't seen them. Any other questions?
Are there any other reports outside of the Western world of this occurring?
All over the world. They've been described in Japan, in India, all over the world. In fact, one of the things I didn't touch on is we're actually working with a polling company. And we're going to do an international poll to actually see the prevalence of this experience among people at home. But I know that there are definitely publications from different countries that have shown it. What you find is that people describe the same core features, but their interpretation of that experience depends on what their culture is. So for example, if you had a Hindu from India who describes one of these, and they say they saw like a light, they may say that I saw Krishna or another Hindu deity. If it's a Christian who happens to be a strong Christian, they may say, I saw Jesus. If you're an atheist, you'll say, well, I don't know, I just saw a light. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was interesting. I don't know why I had it. But people are seeing the same thing, but describing it based upon their own cultural background and their own viewpoint, which happens all the time, of course, in every other setting too. So I think watch this space for AWARE-2 and all the others that come out from it. All right. Well, thank you very much then.